Hey everyone, Nick Genetakis here. In this video, let's go over going over an unfamiliar codebase. And this topic comes up quite often as a software developer. For example, maybe you want to learn how to contribute to open source software, or you just got hired somewhere, either through a regular job or doing some freelance work, but the end goal is the same, where you just have this brand new codebase to work with. It's like, well, how do you get started? I need to be able to start it up and then figure out I want to add some features to the application because that's my job and things like that. From my experience being a freelance developer for about 20 years, I have figured out that not too many companies treat documentation as first class. So usually you're not going to be able to find a really well-documented README file with perfect step-by-step instructions that's going to work exactly for you. And this was actually more of a problem in the past where you have developers on Windows and Mac and Linux, and if you're trying to get up a Python application that's using Postgres and Redis, or maybe you're using Rails, or there are so many things that you had to install manually. At least nowadays, a lot of projects are using Docker, so usually it's a matter of running a Docker compose up -- build, and then you're pretty much on your way. But, that's only half the story of getting the application up and running. And now it's well, how do I explore this application? How do I gain some quick insights on how to even start or even figure out what this thing does? So in this video, we're going to look at 3 different applications. One of them will be a Flask application that I wrote, which is the Flask course material that we go over. Another application is going to be an open source Phoenix application, which is a web framework written in Elixir, and it's going to be up on GitHub, so we'll get to see how we can go over that. And the third one will be another open source Ruby on Rails app that we'll take a look at the end. But even if you don't use any of those languages or web frameworks, the tactics used in this video will apply to anywhere. So if you're working with a Django or a Node app or something like that, then you can pretty much follow along, but you would apply it to those projects instead. So let's actually start with pretty much the worst case scenario, right? Where maybe the project isn't fully open source. So you can't just go on GitHub and then, take a look at the project there, because GitHub actually has some pretty nice UI elements that help you break down a project to see what it's composed of. It shows you what language it is and then the percentages of the languages, and we'll look at that stuff pretty soon. But for now, we're just looking at an LS here of the Flask course. And, this is pretty intimidating. It's you're sitting here looking at this output and you don't even know how big is the application? What technologies is this thing using? You kind of have to dig around to figure this stuff out. So I kind of like to work from the bottom up. So in this case, it's kind of easy. Well, it's not easy, right? But we can at least, we can see here that we have a Docker file. Okay, so the project is likely using Docker. Okay, there's a Docker compose file. Yep, this project is definitely using Docker. So, there's no magic answer here. You need to have some knowledge of what the heck is going on, right? So if you're getting employed to write a Flask application or something like that, then it's expected that you kind of know Flask. So you might be a little bit familiar with some directory structures, although Flask is a kind of a bad example on that front because Flask is well known for being pretty much like a micro web framework where, there aren't strong opinions guiding you on where you should put stuff. So this is actually a pretty difficult app to start with, which I think is good because you're kind of getting the hard stuff out of the way. But there are some tricks you can do with basically any Flask app or really any app, and that's really the goal of this video. So the first thing I would do is identify the technologies being used in the application. So when you're dealing with Docker, and this is actually going to be a little bit easier if I just open this up in a code editor. So when you're dealing with Docker, right, there's this thing, a Docker compose file, which is pretty standard in most Docker projects, at least in development and production too. So let's take a look here at this Docker compose file, right? It's not really that important to understand every single line in this file, but the goal here, right, number one, is to kind of figure out what's going on. So if you're taking a new job and you kind of know that it's a Flask application, you kind of know it's running Python under the hood, but there are other services that you need to check out. So for example, a quick win here is just to look at the list of services in the Docker compose file, right? We can see here that we're using Postgres, okay? We have Redis, okay? Then we have this web service. This is actually the Flask app itself. And then if we keep going down here, we also have a worker. In the case of Flask, that will be Celery. In the case of Rails, that's probably going to be Sidekick. But you know, these are just the main components of the application. So right away, we can see that we have 4 services, right? Postgres, Redis, Web, and Worker. Now, if you're not working with, let me just open up a new window here, and then we'll go back to this project because I do want to show something. Source courses, build a SaaS app with Flask. Okay. So if your project is not using Docker, and by the way, I'm kind of going to focus on projects using Docker only because nowadays it seems like a lot of open source projects and a lot of client work that I'm doing, like everybody is hopping on board with Docker. And I'm not just saying that because I happen to have a Docker course. Like I'm not even going to mention that course. Like you can find it on my website if you really want. But you know, if the project you're working on isn't using Docker, then you're kind of in a little bit of a world of hurt because you have to kind of figure out how to set up your development environment, like installing Python, installing some type of virtual environment, installing Postgres, installing Redis. Like those are very tricky things to do if you're not super experienced. And, you know, that's going to really, really vary depending on what operating system you have. Mac OS, Windows, Linux, like it's all different. But at least in the Docker case, getting the app actually up and running is usually just as simple as doing a Docker compose up -- build, and you'll be on your way. So I've actually done that off camera already just to speed up the process now. So like when I do a Docker compose up, it takes about 5 seconds to spin up Postgres and Redis and the Flask application and the background worker. And now if I actually go to my browser and go to localhost port 8000, then we can see the application. It's a little dice game that we roll up. It's basically like an example SaaS application, but that's not important. What's really important is like once I've identified the technologies used, then the next step is I really switch gears and kind of go from like a top-down approach. So now it's like, well, what does this application actually do? So with Flask, there's this thing called the Flask debug toolbar, and we won't really need to use this if you're using Ruby on Rails and Phoenix, because the end result, really what I'm looking for here is to be able to take a look at a list of routes. So a list of routes are basically like as high level as it gets with the web application. You know, if these are the URLs that you would type out to access whatever content that you're interested in. So what I like to do really in any web framework, you know, for any new web app that I'm working on, it's getting this list of routes because this gives me a really good idea of like, how big is this application? Let me identify some components of the application because with Flask, you know, it's a very non-opinionated framework at least. So things can really be anywhere. So it's not like Rails where you can just go to like an app folder and then you can see models, controllers, views, etc. So with Flask, yeah, it could be kind of anywhere. But in this case, because I kind of like looking at real examples, you know, if we look at this route list, we can be like, okay, well, there's an account component. There's also some form of admin. And then we can do this thing like betting. Okay, then there's something healthy. Like I know what this is, but maybe you don't know what it is, but it's basically like a health check endpoint. So then we have, okay, we can log in, we can log out. There's some privacy things. Okay, there's a settings page. Okay, there's some webhooks with Stripe and like subscriptions. And there's like terms of service and like welcome and all this other stuff. So now it's like, well, if you want to identify what some of these things do, you can be like, okay, so that's the contact page. So if I just go to, you know, /contact, okay, so there's a contact form. And then we can go back to the routes list here. And this kind of just gives you a way to really explore the project in a pretty friendly way. So if you're using actually Ruby on Rails or Phoenix, you know, there probably are some forms of like debug toolbars, but to get a routes list, it's very, very simple. You just go to literally any route that doesn't exist. So if you go to like localhost port 8000 / like a whole bunch of random characters, with Flask, it's going to throw an error of 404 like this. But with Rails and Phoenix, if you're running it in development mode, it will show you a full list of available routes, very, very, very similar to what we see here. So now I think that's a pretty good way to get started because now at least you know like what the components of the application are, like what it actually does. Another thing that I kind of like to do once in a while is if I really have no idea like about the project at all, and I kind of just want to get a scope of like how big is this project? Like, what are we dealing with? Is it like, you know, 200 lines of code and a couple things? Like, you know, the route list gives you a pretty good idea of like, that's a pretty decent sized app, right? There was like admin dashboard, subscriptions and user accounts and emails and signing in and out and account profiles, like that's a pretty good size app. But sometimes you kind of just want to go like one step deeper and kind of figure out like, okay, that's cool. Like, what does that actually mean? Like what's the scope of things? So for that, what I like to do is use the find command. Syntax is always tricky. Like I always forget. Okay, so like if I want to look at all the Pi files in this project recursively, like that's the command that you can run, I hope. Okay, so yeah, like that's going to list every single Python file. But what you can do now at this point is you can do like a word count L that will count all the lines, but we can't just run it like that. We actually have to pipe it to xargs. So basically what it's going to do now is for each of these found files, it's going to run word count L. And then now when we rerun it, we can see here, if we scroll up to the top, we can see like, oh, okay, so there's even more stuff in this project that we didn't even anticipate with the routes list. Like there's this notion of like CLI commands that we can run, and there's like a couple hundred lines of code there. Some like library folder that has a couple hundred lines of code. And like, oh, okay, so you know, with Flask, you need some domain knowledge here. Like Flask has this concept of a blueprint. So that should ring some bells to you if you're a Flask developer. So at least now you kind of know where to get started to looking at like the main web application. But you can see here that, you know, we can get an idea of all the lines of code just for Python. And we can see here at the bottom that there's like, you know, 6,500 lines of code. And then what you could also do is maybe do that for HTML. And then you can see a list of like, okay, here's all the HTML files. These are really actually Jinja 2 templates. They just have an HTML extension, which is pretty standard in the Flask world. So yeah, we have a couple thousand lines of HTML. Okay, what are we doing CSS-wise? We have a lot of that? Oh, okay, well, we got a couple, you know. I mean, these are like some minified vendor CSSs, but like the main CSS, only 200 lines of code. It's not too bad. What about some JavaScript? Okay, 400 lines of code. Majority of it is our custom main.js. So, I mean, just like you can use prior experience if you have it, but like if you look at these ratios, you can be like, okay, there's like 6,000 lines of Python code, quite a lot of HTML templates, like Jinja 2 templates, not too much CSS, and, you know, very little JavaScript. So you can make an assumption right away where it's like, okay, you know what, this application is probably rendered server-side, you know, using Jinja 2 templates, and there's probably some sprinkles of JavaScript in there to do like whatever needs to be done, like maybe like updating, you know, form output, like Flash messages based on certain things. Like, who knows, right? That stuff is all unknown. But the goal here kind of is figuring out like, what does this application do? And now we have a pretty decent idea, at least of, you know, the routes that it has available and like the size of the project. And I find that really helps just to get that like in your mind. So suddenly now when you do like an LS here, you know, still a lot of unknowns, but at least you have an idea of what's going on. We can even see here, you know, if you're using like prior experience, maybe you can look at some folders that might give you some ideas of potentially where things are located. So like, you know, even here, like the find command with JavaScript really helped us figure out that, okay, we have this public folder and inside scripts, like that's where the main JavaScript file is. So if you were tasked with maybe, you know, I don't know, adding some like client-side validation to some of the form, like you would know like, okay, so that's the JavaScript file I need to go to. So that's pretty much a strategy I would use for kind of identifying an unknown code base. In this case, it's not really unknown because it's mine, but I would do the same thing for any other code base. And actually, that is something I did quite recently. So if I go to changelog.com, so actually, let me just go to this, the page itself, if you're not familiar. Changelog is basically, well, it's primarily a podcast. I don't want to say like a CMS. Well, I mean like the technical details. It's like a content management system for podcasts and news and stuff like that. But they have some pretty interesting developer podcasts. But what's really cool about this whole entire page is this whole entire page is open source. You know, it's all up here on GitHub. If you just go to github/thechangelog/changelog.com, and I'll leave all these links in the description, but we can take a look here at the project. So let's say that, you know, you wanted to kind of maybe fix a bug. Like maybe you were using the site and you found some bug and you were like, whoa, that shouldn't happen. Maybe let me double check with the developer. So they have like a Slack channel that you can go to. And so maybe step one would be talking to that developer and seeing what's up, see if they're open to doing pull requests and things like that, which I'm sure they probably are. I know they are definitely in the changelog case. But yeah, so like the next step would be like, how do you get familiar with a code base like this? And I actually did this myself recently. So in case you didn't know from last week, I did a video on kind of like how to start a brand new project from scratch. And the project I was building is a course hosting platform. And I happen to be using Phoenix, which is a web framework in Elixir. And it just so happens that the changelog is written in pretty much the same stack. So that's really good. So basically what that meant for me is like, well, I'm not going to like fork this project because, this is super specific to like a podcast CMS and like this has nothing to do really with hosting courses, but there's some great features in this application that are very non-specific to podcasts, like, the whole entire user flow. So they use magic links. Basically, you just join by putting in your email address and then they send you a link and then you confirm that link and then you're signed in for however long the cookies are going to be valid for, maybe 6 months or a year or until you decide to clear them on your browser. But anyways, I wanted to get familiar with this code base so I can start picking out some of those features and implementing into my custom Phoenix application. So the first thing I did was I went to GitHub, and I looked at this page that we're looking at now. So one really cool thing about GitHub is, we have these colored bars on the bottom that I know you're familiar with, right? And then when you click one of those, you can actually see like what component of the application, like what each component of the application is made up of. So like half of the application is Elixir. We have a pretty good amount of HTML, pretty decent amount of CSS, and a reasonable amount of JavaScript. I mean, if you're looking at this relative to the Elixir, it's like more than a 10% ratio. Then we have some like makefile stuff and some other stuff. But, just like we use the find command on the command line, we can get some pretty decent insight about this just by looking at these breakdowns. So like we don't have lines of code, although GitHub guys, if you're watching, or gals, this would be a pretty cool feature. Maybe it would be a little bit tricky to pull off, but if you can kind of like mouse over that, or maybe just underneath there, if it showed like lines of code, like that would be pretty cool. But even without the lines of code, you can kind of get an idea of like what this project is about. So it's like we have a lot of Elixir, a lot of HTML, a little bit of CSS, a little bit of JavaScript. Without even looking at the source code, you can kind of figure out that, this is probably another like server-side render templates, probably not using React, for the whole entire application. Like this isn't a single page application. Although when you actually browse around, it feels like one because it's using TurboLinks, but that's a whole nother can of worms that we're not going to really open on this video. But, now we kind of have our, LS output over here. Things are sorted a little bit nicer. We have directories on top, but I would do the same exact strategy as I did in the Flask application. And that's to kind of just skim through the code base and look for familiar things that I might be familiar with. So like, I really don't know that much about Phoenix, right? Like I read the super ultra basic documentation. I didn't read any books. I just basically went at it. So like I was just looking for things that sort of looked familiar to me. And then I saw some familiar things like, okay, there's a Docker Compose file. In this case, they actually have a Docker folder instead of the Docker stuff being in the root of the directory. But okay, so like right away, there's Docker. And it's based on Elixir because it says it right here. So like, what are some of the other services related to this project? Well, we can use the same exact strategies that we did before, where it's like we can take a look here at the Docker Compose YAML file. And we can see here we have a DB service that uses Postgres. They decided to name it DB instead of Postgres. That's totally cool. So then we have the app service, just like the one that we looked at before with Flask. I happen to call mine web, whatever. Details aren't important. So what other services do they have here? And then you can see like, oh, well, that's really it. So there's a database and a web application. Like there's no Redis, there's no like dedicated background worker, because I guess with their application and using Elixir, they determined that I guess that wasn't necessary, so they don't need it. So we can see the complexity of this app at a very high level. Okay, it's like DB app. That's it. And then just like before, you can basically do a Docker Compose up or Docker Compose up -- build, and you would be on your way. But I'm not going to bother doing that on video now. But another thing too, it's like, as I started pulling away some of these features, so like I wanted to figure out like, how do I get that magic link feature into my application? So, I pretty much cloned this on my computer. So I had the source code so I can use Vim to like move around and check things out. But eventually, I learned a little bit more about Phoenix, and I kind of realized, where to go to find this type of stuff. So like in this lib folder, typically you would have like project name _web. And like these are all the web components for your application. So like I kind of started with the controllers, and then I was like, oh, so there's like an auth controller, and there's a person controller. And like I don't want to get super like lost in the woods for Phoenix. But yeah, I just basically started going through their application, tracing the code as needed. So like once you know like what a controller is, like, we have these functions in here that are tied into specific routes. And yeah, so like tracing code is a very important thing to be aware of, just for getting familiar with the code base. Like for example, if we look at this, like person.refresh auth token, okay? Like what does that do? If you never looked at the code base, you have no idea. But you can see here, like this requires a little bit of Elixir knowledge, but basically you can see here we have this changelog module, and then like we're basically importing it, we can say. It's not technically an import, but like this is how we're getting access to that. So it's like, okay, so changelog person, that's responsible for this function here, refresh auth token. So like I would go back to the library folder, go to changelog, and then I would go to schema here, sorry about that, and then I would go to person. So in their case, the module is actually changelog.person, but they put it in a schema folder because they have a whole bunch of other things in there. Again, don't want to get super lost in the woods here, but the thing that we were looking for was refresh auth token. So it's like, oh, so this is the implementation of the refresh auth token. And if you're actually using like, some type of code editor that has like jump to definition, like that type of stuff is super useful for exploring a new code base. But, I'm kind of just doing this through GitHub, so it's a very manual process. But, now it's like, okay, refresh auth token, it takes this and it expires on that, like that's a default value. And like, okay, so we're going to do this and then this, like a little bit complicated because like refreshing auth tokens is funny enough, like I didn't plan this video, right? Super unscripted, but like this is one of the more complicated things. But yeah, so like you would just continue tracing through code where you need to, and you can kind of copy paste that code into your code base, or, whatever you want to do. In my case, I was working on the code base for a while, and, you can see this is almost from, committed on May 15th, 2018. Like that's literally a year ago. So just a little backstory on this. I did start my course platform. I thought it was like 9 months ago, but apparently it was like a year ago. But I didn't get very far at all because I didn't have any, like at the time, the motivation to finish it wasn't very high. So really I was just kind of like noodling around with the code base, never really officially planned it out, was sort of just like, like very, very haphazardly messing around with it. But now for the past week or two, I've been really going at it. But anyways, point is, like, let's say you want to contribute to an open source project. We can see here that a year ago, roughly, I decided to contribute something quite minor. So I was, tracing through his code base, just like we did before. And like in this auth controller, we were doing a lookup to get a specific person by their email address. And previously, they were using this type of code here, where it was like repo1, and then there's like an inline SQL query fragment, and like, I don't know, like at this point I wasn't very experienced with Elixir or Phoenix, but I'm like, there's no way it's that hard just to like get a single record filtered by some field in your database. And like maybe it was when he wrote that a couple of years ago, but things have gotten quite a lot nicer. And I was looking through some documentation on Phoenix and Ecto, which is basically like the thing this repo is related to, but not going to get into that in this video. But they do have this new function now called get by, where you just pass in, the schema or the model that you're interested in, and then you just put in the fields that you would like to filter on. So I made this very, very small refactor here through a pull request, where I just took every instance of, the old code, made it the new code. I did this in a feature branch. I forked his repo, put it up there, opened the pull request, and he was cool that he liked it, and then he merged it in, and that was it. So now, I'm a contributor to the code base, and this was literally days after just messing around with the super basics of the project. So you don't need to be a full-blown super expert just to contribute to an open source project. If you find something that maybe you can improve, or in this case, it's a very small refactor, yeah, do it up. Make the pull request. What's the worst that can happen? Actually, on that topic, when did I do this? A week ago or something? Something like that. Yeah, 6 days ago. So again, very specific to Phoenix, but I figured let me just open up a pull request where we'll just change the JSON library to JSON instead of Poison, because apparently JSON's a lot faster. It's going to be the new default in Phoenix, and even now Phoenix recommends using JSON. So I'm okay, we'll just configure Phoenix to use the JSON library for its JSON library, and then when it comes to parsing it, we'll just read from this JSON library thing that got introduced with I think it was Phoenix 1.4, I don't know, but this is a very small pull request, right? It's changing something that should have been technically, I think, backwards compatible, maybe, don't quote me on that, but in the end, it actually failed. So not all of your pull requests are going to get merged, because when things are broken, it just so happens that they have some custom Slack code that I was very unaware of. Anyways, it was written in such a way that it didn't work with that encoder, so the pull request failed. So the idea now is, he's going to make some changes, I think, to the stuff that broke, and then, then it'll be able to be merged in, and life will be good. So now let's take a look at another project. This is the dev.to website. Don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's a pretty substantially sized Ruby on Rails application. And I've never ran it locally personally, but I have gone to the site a number of times. I've actually wrote quite a few things here. It's basically I guess you can say a blog/community for developers. It's like Medium, except it doesn't suck, and it's really, 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 really focused to developers. Actually, relating it to Medium is almost insulting. So it's nothing like Medium. It's actually good. Sorry about that, Medium, if you're watching, just the way it is. So let's take a look here at this project, right? It's a Ruby application, pretty good amount of HTML, pretty good amount of JavaScript, decent amount of CSS, some shell scripting, Dockerfile. So I must be using Docker as well. So if we actually look here at the homepage for the changelog one, and we take a look here at the ratios, we have 50, 30, we'll say 6. And then for the dev2 one, it's 48, 27, 14, whatever, 15. So the ratios are almost pretty similar. I mean, there's more JavaScript in this application, but again, just looking at the ratios can really determine that this is mostly a server-side rendered Rails application with a little bit of JavaScript. And we didn't even have to look at anything to determine that, other than this nice little loadout from GitHub. And if it wasn't on GitHub and we just had to clone it on our computer, then we could have just used the find command, and then we would have figured out the same information. So, and again, this is a Rails application, so if you're familiar with Rails, there's certain things that you can do to get started. For example, after getting the application up and running on my computer, the first thing I would do is go to an invalid URL just to get that list of routes. And also it really helps, by the way, that there is a public instance of this application running. So, I mean, you would still definitely want to run it on your computer, but, just for messing around initially, having it run here is pretty nice, because you can actually go to things like, okay, whatever, there's a web dev topic with a T. So it's you can look at that list of routes and then kind of figure out the code responsible for listing this. So that's definitely how I would start. Also, like if you go to something like the config folder in Rails, there is like a routes RB file that has a list of all the routes that are available. I find this a little bit harder to read than just looking at the list in the website. For example, like this to me is way easier to mentally parse because it's like, that's the endpoint, you know, or I should say that's the actual route, you know, the URL that you would type in, and like, here's the code responsible or the endpoint name. But yeah, it's just much easier than reading something like this, where it's like, now you have the noise of the programming language in the way, you know, things are formatted differently. It's a little bit harder to follow. But also, if you're working with Phoenix, probably unlikely, but you never know. If you go to the lib folder, inside of the underscore web folder, it has a very similar thing, router.ex. So you can also see your routes here. Flask doesn't have this notion. You basically just, you know, well, there's not that many opinions, right? Like technically, you probably could write something like this if you wanted to, but yeah. In fact, there's actually a Flask CLI command that you can run, which gives you this route list if you need it. But yeah, so basically, once you understand the routes that you want, you just trace and code like before. So in the case of this dev2, this is actually new to me. Like, I really never looked at their code base that much. But immediately, Docker ignore file. Okay, so they're probably using Docker. What else do they have here? Okay, gitpod Docker file, that's fine. Rubocop, okay, so there's some linting going on. That's always good to know. So I don't know if you know this, but if you're a Ruby developer, Rubocop is a way to lint your code. So you can figure out, like, you know, things should be formatted like this. Like if you're using too many spaces here, it should get changed to that. And like Flake8 is very similar in Python. And for Elixir, they actually have mixed format, which will format your code based on specifications that are built into the language, which is very, very nice. Another good thing to look at too, like Travis CI, okay, so there's probably a decent test suite. And same thing with changelog and the Flask application. If you really want to kind of figure out how things work, then looking for tests is a very, 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 very good way to actually see how things are implemented. So, but I understand if you're working on some freelance projects, it's actually not guaranteed that you're going to have tests, so your mileage may vary, but any big, decent open source project is probably going to have a ton of tests. So, you know, if you do make a change, then you should probably test it locally. So I got a little cute with this one. So in my course hosting platform, I am using JSON instead of Poison, and it just worked immediately with this exact change. Like I literally changed it to this and it worked. Like I don't have that Slack stuff that they have, which is super specific, and it didn't account for that. So it's a very good idea to have tests. And I don't think he would have merged it without testing it locally himself, but having it public, like a CI service, is also quite useful. Anyways, getting way off topic for this type of video, but you know, as I go through this source code here, we can see familiar things like we have a Docker file, we have Docker Compose file. We also have a proc file, which is kind of interesting because it's unlikely that Dev2 is hosted on Heroku. I mean, maybe it is actually. I have no idea, to be honest. But typically, yeah, what was that old Ruby library? Was it called Foreman? Something like that? It's been so long since I've used like a non-Dockerized setup. Because I know there's Honcho for Python, but basically the idea is you have a proc file, and then it almost works like a Docker Compose file for finding the services in the application. So in this case, they have a web and worker. I guess they don't decide that they want to start Postgres and other things here, because I imagine it's using Postgres. That's a pretty standard thing. So actually, let's take a look here at the Compose file and see what's going on. So we have a web service, okay. Then we have a job service, which is basically the worker. Then we have a DB Postgres, yep. And then they have Webpacker, which is Rails specific, but it's basically like a Webpack dev server. So we can see that they do have quite a bit more. Well, we don't know for sure that they have more JavaScript. Well, we know for sure they have a decent amount of JavaScript based on this, but yeah, they are using Webpack. Whoops, clicked the wrong link. So yeah, I mean, that's really the strategy I would use. So, you know, using GitHub to kind of explore an open source project is nice. Usually once I'm familiar with getting the route set up and like I understand what the app is doing, I have a scope of its size, then it's like, there's no like textbook or script for what to do after that. It's like, you got to do what you got to do. Like, I don't know what you're doing. Are you adding like some front end stuff? Are you adding like a new URL endpoint? Like with Rails, are you adding like a whole new like, model and like controller and templates and all this other stuff? Like, I don't know what you're doing, but tracing code is a surefire way to understand what's going on, and then you can go from there. So usually I wouldn't do this through GitHub. Like, I would definitely use a code editor for that. Code editor really depends. Like, I happen to like Vim. VS Code is also great. Like, many different options. PyCharm, RubyMine, all that stuff. Oh yeah, there was one more thing too, and that's going over the list of packages that the project uses. For example, in a Python project, you would want to look for a requirements.txt file. And in a Rails project, you can just go to the gem file, which we can take a look here. And this is a really good way to figure out like what packages or gems or libraries that the project is using. So if you take a look here at this gem file for the dev2 project, we can see that, man, it is using a lot of gems. There's 100 gems. Well, there's 100 lines there, a little bit less than 100 gems, but there's a lot. There's got to be at least 70, 80. If you count all the dev stuff, definitely over 100 for sure. But, these are all dependencies, like third-party dependencies that the application uses. And in the case of changelog, or Elixir more specifically, there is a mix.exs file that we can take a look at, and we can see that list of dependencies here. We can see that it's using Phoenix 1.4 and so on. Quite a few dependencies as well. Not quite as much as a Dev2 site, but then again, the Dev2 site does a lot more things than the changelog site, but that's not important. But yes, going over this dependency file is a great way just to kind of figure out what's going on, especially if you have some experience with that web framework or technology already. Anyways, that's pretty much it for this video. I hope that gets you started with exploring a new code base. Thanks for watching. Let me know how it goes in the comments, like what are some tactics that you use, and I will see you in the next one. See ya.